The Trump administration has produced and attracted a number of characters, and tonight we are hearing from a man who, for a time there, was in the news every night. Washington, D.C. attorney Ty Cobb grew up in Kansas, the son of a legendary Kansas broadcaster named Grover C. Cobb. Ty went on to Harvard and Georgetown Law and along the way became a mustache enthusiast. He is named for his distant relative, the Baseball Hall of Famer of the same name. That Ty Cobb was known as a tough, if not thoroughly dirty player who often slid into base with his cleats up high. Ty Cobb, the lawyer, is a seasoned Washington veteran who took on as a client one Donald Trump, who went on to trash the Mueller investigation as a witch hunt and the investigators as a bunch of, quote, angry Democrats. But Ty Cobb, the now former Trump lawyer, doesn't seem to agree with that assessment. In a new ABC News podcast, Cobb now says he never had a bad interaction with Robert Mueller or his staff and went on to offer his praise of the special counsel.
What do you think of Bob Mueller?
I think Bob Mueller is an American hero. I think Bob Mueller is a guy that, even though he came from an arguably privileged background, has a backbone of steel. He walked into a firefight in Vietnam to pull out one of his injured colleagues and was appropriately honored for that. I've known him for 30 years as a prosecutor and a friend, and I think the world of Bob Mueller. He is a very deliberate guy, but he's also a class act and a very justice-oriented person.
Ty Cobb also spoke about current Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani and his efforts to discredit this Russia investigation.
I was there for the White House. Rudy is there to represent the individual. But keep in mind that, that you can criticize the strategy. It wouldn't have been my strategy. I don't feel the same way about Mueller. I don't feel the investigation is a witch hunt. Rudy and the president have been effective in a way that, would not have been preferable for me, but they have ratcheted up the public's concerns about the investigation and its legitimacy. I object to that approach, but it's his choice. He's the president, and it's what Clinton did to Ken Starr.
With us to talk about all of this, Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. attorney, former senior FBI official as well, and Matthew Miller, former chief spokesman for the U.S. Department of Justice. And Matt, I understand you knew Ty Cobb in a previous life. Anything there surprise you?
Not really. I did work with Ty in the private sector. We shared a client a few years ago. I think, if you look at what Ty said about Bob Mueller, it's what you would expect anyone in his position in Washington to say. I mean, Bob Mueller has been respected for a long time.
American hero.
American hero. It only sounds so unusual because it is so out of keeping with the people that Ty Cobb worked with at the White House, from the president on down. It's not what you hear from the president. It's not what you hear from his new outside counsel. Well, not new anymore, but new when Ty Cobb left. Rudy Giuliani. It's not what you hear from his spokesperson. So it's this odd thing where remarks that are in keeping with what you would expect from any seasoned member of the defense bar just sound bizarre because that's not what you hear from this president. Yeah, Chuck, do you also subscribe to that view? This is what you would hear from an established Washington lawyer about Mueller and the investigation. Is it possible that counsel to this president often make their public utterances about an audience of one, their client?
Yeah, 100%, Brian. Look, as well as being part of the legal establishment in Washington, Ty Cobb grew up in the United States Department of Justice. He was an assistant U.S. attorney in Baltimore. And for those of us who grew up that way professionally, we know a couple of things, that Bob Mueller is an icon in our Department of Justice. And as Ty said, and I know him as well, and I think he's a decent fellow, Bob Mueller is also a class act. And so Ty is probably a little bit more free now to speak honestly than he was when he was employed by Mr. Trump.
Chuck, I also want to play this for you. This is separate from the same interview. This is Ty Cobb on his former client, the president, Donald Trump.
He is a very direct, forceful presence. He wants to get stuff done. He hates obstacles, and and he reacts strongly in the face of obstacles to try to move them out of the way or find somebody who will move them out of the way for him so he can do things. It's a challenging environment, and it's not for everybody. But it was a fascinating task.
Chuck, do you think the president's current legal team hears that and they are nodding yes?
Oh, I'm sure it was a fascinating task. It seems to be damning with faint praise, Brian. You know, what Ty is saying about the president's dislike of obstacles has to be read in context. Those obstacles are a legitimate inquiry, a legitimate investigation by federal prosecutors and federal agents looking at whether or not Russians interfered with our election. I hate to think of that as an obstacle. I think of that as something that must be investigated, must be examined, something that it would be an absolute abdication of responsibility for the United States Department of Justice, for the FBI, not to look at that. And the president considers that an obstacle. That's deeply unfortunate.
Matt, I've got about 30 seconds. I got to catch a break. Do you think the use of the word obstacle was kind of a euphemism?
Yeah, an understatement, maybe. Look, every president doesn't like obstacles. Every strong leader, every CEO doesn't like obstacles. The question is how you handle them. And I think what Ty was probably alluding to, what he was understanding, is the fact that this president handles them in a lot of ways the most inappropriate fashion possible. And I think what he's especially referring to are the attacks on the special counsel, the attacks on the investigation that he talked about earlier in that interview.
Lawyers and the words they use. Chuck and Matt have agreed to stay with us. We'll fit in a break here, and coming up, tough words today from a federal judge, and again, they are directed at this one man, Mr. Stone, who has for now avoided jail time. We'll talk about it when we come back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.